All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tatia Davenport, CASBO CEO. Thank you for joining us this Friday morning, holiday season, to hear the latest update from our Legislative Analyst Office here in California. We are so honored to have Edgar Cabrall with us today. He's the Deputy Executive of the Legislative Analyst Office, also known as the LAO. The insights that Edgar is going to share today in regards to the report that was dropped yesterday are really going to be important for us as we look at some very challenging fiscal numbers and opportunities ahead. And the information that he'll share is really going to help us shape some of our strategies as we look to the future years and the work that we have to do. So with that, I want to turn it over to Edgar Cabrall. I want to encourage you to use this time to ask questions. You can put them in the Q&A section of the tool, and we will be pausing and taking time to address those as we go. The session is being recorded, so you'll get to reference that later. And with no further delay, Edgar, thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for your time and being a part of this CASBO community. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Tasha. And good morning, everybody. Again, as Tasha said, I'm the deputy of the K-12 education unit at the LAO. So I oversee a group of 4 analysts who cover from childcare through K-12 education in our office. Our role is we are the nonpartisan advisor to the state legislature, and we work principally on budget issues. In some ways, you can think of us as sort of counterparts to the administration's Department of Finance, but we work for the legislature and not the governor. This report is something that we put out annually. We typically put it out in November, but we did delay that in part. Well, not in part, completely because of the delays in the tax filing deadlines that were granted by the IRS, first from April to October, and then from April to November, which would have been right around when our report is typically published. So we published this a little bit later than we have in the past. We typically write a report that's about the overall state's outlook, and then we do a specific outlook for schools and community colleges. This year, just because of the delays and a number of other factors, we didn't put out a separate school and community college report, but we do have an appendix section where we talk about that in more detail, and that's part of what I'll walk through today. First, I wanted to talk just a little bit of context again about what the purpose of the report is. What is the framework that we use when we're building this report, so you can understand kind of where our findings come from. So what I think of this report is sort of the state's equivalent of what you all might be more familiar with, which is your multi-year budget projections for your own LEAs. So we are looking in our office. We have an economics unit that is projecting general fund revenues over for this coming fiscal year, and then also over the 3 subsequent years. And then we are comparing that revenue estimate with our estimates of expenditures. What are the state's existing commitments? What are the things that the state has committed to last year in this 23-24 budget? And what are the costs associated with those commitments over the next several years? And for us, bottom line, we're trying to figure out, do we think the state has a surplus, that there will be funding to spend, or alternatively, will there be budget deficits that need to be addressed? And this is really the beginning of the budget conversation. This report is released now. The administration is working right now as we speak to build their budget. The governor is required to submit a proposed budget on January 10th. So we think of this as sort of a report that sort of starts the budget conversation about what might come next year. You'll get the administration's perspective and their estimates. They'll have their own estimates of all of these things in January, in addition to a variety of proposals that'll be their approach to balancing the budget. So in this report, we lay out kind of what the budget problem is, and then we, at a very high level, talk about some options that the state has. We're not at this point trying to solve it and provide a very detailed list of solutions. We're trying just a big picture, give the legislature a sense of what tools it has to address the problem. So I think as Tasha mentioned earlier, feel free to put in questions in the Q&A. I will I'm going to stop at a couple points in transition and look through that Q&A, and I'll as things come up, I'll look through as well. So I'll try to answer all your questions as we go along. So first, I'm going to start by talking about the overall state budget situation, and then we'll transition over to specifically schools and community colleges and what this means for them. But overall, so under our report, we have a projected budget deficit of $68 billion for the coming fiscal year. And that's, we talk about that as being the deficit over this budget window. So that means updates of 22-23 and 23-24, and then a projection of 24-25. Every time that the state's passing a budget, we're sort of addressing all of those 3 years at one time. So overall, we have that $68 billion budget problem. Now, how do we get to the $68 billion? Well, first, it's important to highlight that even under the June budget that was passed just a few months ago, that budget, if you look at the administration's projections of revenues and expenditures into subsequent years, was projecting a $14 billion budget deficit for 24-25. So I think those of us who are involved at the state level on the budget knew that already we expected there to be a budget problem, even if all of the administration's assumptions held up over time. So that's kind of the starting point with that $14 billion. Then on top of that, we have significantly lower general fund revenues. And I think this is something that our office, we did publish something a week ago as sort of a preview of kind of what our full report would look like. But we have general fund revenues being $58 billion lower than were assumed across, again, that 3-year period of 22-23, 23-24, 24-25. Part of what, and those declines, the revenue declines on a percentage basis are roughly equivalent to the declines in income tax revenue that we saw during the Great Recession. So they're fairly substantial declines of about 25%. The thing that's particularly unique here in terms of the revenue decline is that 26 billion of that 58, so almost half of it is for the prior year. It's for 22-23. It's the year that already ended, and that's really because of these tax filing delays. One way we think about this issue here, and I think part of what makes this problem particularly unique is if we had been in a sort of more traditional timeline where we got that April tax revenue as we normally did, we would have known that we had this problem in May, and the budget that we just passed would have looked very different. We would have had a budget problem that would have needed to be addressed. But because of the delays in the tax filing deadline, we don't have the ability, we didn't have that knowledge quite yet. And so now the state's sort of a little bit, some of our options have sort of gone away, or some things are a little bit more difficult to address because we already passed the 23-24 budget. So that's a big part of what's unique this year. So you might be doing the math and saying, okay, we had a $14 billion deficit, and then we have a $58 billion decline in revenues. That's $72 billion. And how did we get to 68? The delta, that difference between those, is associated with a few updates that we did associated with state cost of state programs, where some of our estimates are a little bit lower than the administration's. Some of it is automatic spending adjustments and other small things that come in that result in us getting down to that $68 billion. And so this is $68 billion budget deficit, assuming kind of the state is still funding its existing commitments that it had agreed to in the last budget. Now, we do see big revenue declines, and then slowly over time, revenues improving. But we do still see, beyond the budget year, beyond 24-25, under our outlook, we have operating deficits over the period that are about $30 billion. So it's not just a temporary adjustment. It's also a reduction to what's going on with sorry, I just saw a question on the slides. No, I did not have slides here. I will pull up a figure that we'll talk through it in a second, but for right now, I'm just talking through. So in terms of this is our budget problem, assuming that before we decide what action the state takes. But because there are operating deficits, we don't think these are just one-time. They're not just one-time actions. There might be some broader issues that might need to be addressed moving forward. So in this report, we don't highlight a lot of big picture or a lot of very specific recommendations for how you're going to get down, but we do highlight just the overall big picture options that the legislature has. And I think one thing I did mention that the revenue decline was on a percentage basis similar to the Great Recession. I do want to highlight the problem itself in terms of the challenge in addressing the problem is not as bad as it was during the Great Recession. And that's in particular because the state has much more tools available than it did back then. So the state has $24 billion in the budget stabilization account, its general purpose budget reserve. In 2008-9, I believe we had a $1.7 billion reserve, which was kind of immediately wiped out when revenues plummeted in the fall of 2008. So we have a significantly larger budget reserve available. And we have, in addition to that, we have a lot of recent spending in general fund has been one-time spending that's been spread out over multiple years. And so there's an opportunity to pull back on a lot of that spending to get some additional budget savings. We also mentioned a few other big picture big picture things that the state could do. There's cost shifts, like for example, borrowing from special fund loans. The state has also raised revenues during recessions when we did some changes to, for example, the amount of the way that businesses carry net operating losses that provided some temporary revenue increases during the pandemic. So there are a number of other tools that the legislature can use to address that problem. And then we do talk about ongoing spending reductions. Obviously, could be something that needs to happen if we are having trouble addressing all of the solutions. We do also mention that because of because we're seeing this as a multi-year budget problem, the importance of trying to make sure that potentially being judicious with our reserves, that we don't use all the reserves necessarily in the first year, because that would mean that then we could potentially have a bigger problem that we'd have less tools to address moving forward. And so that's something that we are highlighting that perhaps keeping say half of the reserves for a future year would be warranted to help kind of make sure that we have additional tools in future years. So that's the big picture overall budget. Before I get into schools and community colleges, I'm going to stop here to see if there are any questions that anyone has. The one question I see is about alternative options for school funding, and that's going to be my next section of our conversation. So, I won't answer that quite yet because I think the next section will cover it. But I think I'm not seeing any other comments yet. So I think I'll just move on to the next section. So again, that's the big picture budget conversation. In terms of options to address the problem, we lay out all those options. One option I have not talked about yet that we're going to talk about is reducing Proposition 98 spending down to the minimum funding requirement. And so to get into that detail requires me to get into a little bit more technical specifics about our outlook and our assumptions. So let me talk through that, and then I'm going to put up a figure that helps walk through some of these issues. But so first, I think one important caveat: there's been a lot of people who are surprised by the magnitude of the deficit under our outlook, and part of it is because we typically talk about Proposition 98, which is a formula that has a constitutional minimum requirement for schools and community colleges, and we often talk about it as being the rough rule of thumb is for every additional dollar that additional revenue the state gets, then Prop 98 grows by 40 cents. And then similarly, when revenues drop, then you have a 40-cent decline in the required amount for schools and community colleges. What's unique this year is that in our outlook, you don't see that. Virtually all of the revenues dropped $58 billion, and we have over a 3-year period only about a $4 billion reduction in the Prop 98 requirement. And so there's been a lot of surprise about why. And this is partly about how we are building our assumptions when we build this forecast. And it's all predicated again on the fact that the reduction in revenues is disproportionately in 22-23. So typically we do say when we're updating our numbers, we're saying we're presuming that the legislature will be funding Prop 98 at the minimum requirement moving forward. But if we're in a year when we've already appropriated funds, we're not assuming that the state is going to go in and retroactively take funding back to get down to the guarantee. And when we do these exercises, sometimes that occurs, and these are usually small differences particularly when you're talking about the prior year, when it's a fiscal year that ended, these are usually pretty minor changes. It's a very, very big difference this year. And so we are assuming that even though revenues declined by $26 billion in 22-23, we're not presuming that schools are getting their funding reduced. And that means that Prop 98 funding is approximately, I think it's $7.7 billion higher than the minimum requirement in 22-23. And because of the way the Prop 98 formulas can operate, sometimes it actually results in sort of a higher base that then carries forward, for moving forward. So then the Prop 98 spending, the minimum requirement is higher over that period. So if you look at the difference between what Prop 98 funding would have been if you just funded the minimum every year versus what Prop 98 would have been if you do what we assume, which is that you stay at this higher level and then it changes the calculations moving forward, that difference is $16.7 billion in spending. And so part of the $68 billion budget problem is that we're spending the $16.7 billion higher than the minimum. So given the magnitude of the problem, we do in our report highlight that the legislature has options for reducing Prop 98 spending, and we bring up one specific reduction. And so I'm going to pull up this figure right now just to give you all to walk through this. Let's see. So this is, can you see that? Tasha, can you see? Yeah, okay, excellent. So this is the figure. We have as I mentioned, we have an appendix in the report that talks about school funding. And this is one of the figures in the report that I'm gonna walk through a little bit to help you understand the various options the option that we lay out. And really, this is just one option. Again, as I mentioned, this is still early in the process, so we're not trying to give the legislature the solution that's going to solve all the problems, but it's giving them a range of possibilities of what's possible under our outlook. So I know there's a lot in the chart, so I'm going to walk through. So this darker bar here is called the enacted budget level. This is Prop 98 spending from the June budget, and then for 24-25, this is the projected amount. This is how much the state had estimated, or the administration estimated the guarantee would be in 24-25. This green level here, this is the Proposition 98 spending using what we're calling our baseline assumption, which is where we assume that we keep 22-23 spending at that higher spending level. We don't do anything to bring the adjustment. And so you can see here, this is that $7.7 billion difference between that. And then these dark bars are what happens if you fund at the minimum guarantee. So there's a $7.7 billion difference. There is this minor drop here, you can see, and that's mainly because there is a Prop 98 reserve requirement. So during sort of quote unquote good times, some of the Prop 98 funding is supposed to be deposited into a reserve. And then during bad times, it can be pulled out. So under the June budget, there was an assumption that some funding would be deposited into that reserve. Because of the revenues that we have now, all of that requirement goes away. And so that's the only automatic adjustment down that happens in 22-23. So you can see the green would give you a sense of if we were in our main forecast, what would happen to school funding. So you would see you would go from 106.0, 106.2 to $113 billion. In that situation, again, where you were not coming down in 22-23, schools are doing just fine. There is I think there's a slight reduction in the guarantee here. But as I'll mention later, it can be covered with the reserve. And then actually the guarantee is higher under our baseline funding assumption than even the estimate in June. And this is more than enough to cover the cost of growth plus the cost of living adjustment. The cost of living adjustment or we project that the cost of funding programs in 24-25, including the cost of living adjustment, is $109.3 billion. So you'd have more than enough to cover cost of program plus COLA here, plus some additional discretionary ongoing. The other thing is that during the budget, in our outlook, during the assumptions the formulas would require that we actually withdraw all of the funding from the Prop 98 reserve. We have $8.1 billion in funding in the Prop 98 reserve right now. These are for years 21, 22, and earlier. And so schools would be getting growth in COLA plus additional funding, and then the funding from the reserve would actually be such that there would also be additional one-time funding to spend in this budget. Now, at the same time, this is all presuming that the $68 billion budget deficit is all addressed outside of the school and community college budget. So we recognize that there might be a challenge in doing so, and that the legislature might want some options for how maybe there could be some reductions to schools and community colleges. So the option that we lay out is to take this funding that's in the reserve, and this is predicated on the assumption that there would ultimately be an emergency budget declaration. When there's an emergency budget declaration, the legislature has the authority to take out funding in the Prop 98 reserve and use it outside of what the formulas require. But that funding, and then that funding has to be used for school and community college purposes, but there's no specificity on exactly how it has to be used. There's a lot of flexibility there. So what we're suggesting, the option that we throw out here is essentially to take $7.7 billion of Prop 98 funding that we've provided to schools and replace it with funding from the Prop 98 reserve. So from a school's perspective, that doesn't change your amount of funding. It's more an accounting thing at the state level in terms of how much funding comes from one pot versus the other. But what it does is, because of the way the Prop 98 formulas work, this is the Prop 98 reserve. This is funding that that has gone towards covering the Prop 98 requirement in past years when we deposited it. For the purposes of the calculations, we're now technically starting with this funding level that's down here. And that results in that adjustment means that the guarantee would decrease over these two years. So instead of funding at 106.2, you'd be funding at 102, and then you could fund at 108. And then the reserve would mostly be used up for that purpose, but you would avoid having to make any reductions in 22, 23, or any of those years for schools. So what would that mean? You might think, well, there's still, now that's less money than the previous example. So what does that mean for schools and community colleges? It does mean that in this year, there would be a bit of a shortfall. I think the overall costs to cover programs is something around $107 billion. And so there would be about a $5 billion shortfall here. If the state wanted to get all the way down to the guarantee, there would need to be some actions to make some solutions. We do know that there's still one-time spending or other funds within Prop 98 that have not yet been allocated. Some of them are from grant programs that we are still getting up and running, or that just have not distributed all the funding yet. So we would, I think one of the expectations we have is that over the next several months, there will be a lot of looking at those programs and identifying how much savings can be pulled back as an alternative to, say, making actual cuts to programs. So we think a lot of that issue could be addressed through that, but there still might be other reductions that might need to take effect. They would need to be, and based on our outlook, they would need to just be one-time in nature. They don't need to be ongoing. And then you would be funding schools at $108 billion over here in 24-25. This is enough to cover the costs of all the programs that are funded in 23-24, to not cut them and not make reductions to those programs, but it is not enough money to provide a statutory COLA. So that would be the impact here. So I know these are very wonky conversations, and so I apologize for how technical they are, but I think the bottom line big picture, I would say, is under our main outlook, where we're assuming that school funding stays at the higher level in 22-23. There's enough funding. There are no programmatic reductions to schools. If anything, schools have enough funding to cover COLA, plus provide discretionary increases in funding and additional one-time funding. But that leaves the rest of the state with a huge budget problem that needs to be addressed all outside of schools. So we give a different option that would allow the legislature to have some reductions in Prop 98 funding. And under that approach, schools would be able to keep their ongoing programs, but there would not be enough funding to cover COLA, essentially. And there might need to be some one-time reductions. So that's sort of the big picture difference. I think of these as two possible options, right? This is not like we're saying do this one, don't do this and do this one. And I think the option where we do bring spending down, we're still spending at the minimum guarantee. So it sort of gives the legislature a range of possibilities of what they could do. You could do something in between, right? You don't have to do, you could say, we don't want to make one-time reductions, so we're not going to do anything to address that here. We're going to just leave that spending as it is. You don't get as much general fund savings for to solve the budget problem, but you still are able to get significant savings. So it's really a matter at that point of just trying to decide what's helpful, what's what the legislature wants to do. So that was everything that I had planned to talk about. Obviously, these options will be discussed more. This will come up in the future. We will see the administration is currently in the middle of developing its own budget that will be released in January. So we will see if they have any proposals that are attempting to do something like this. But we definitely think this is something that will be part of the conversation moving forward. And I'm looking at some questions. Okay, so one question was, do you see any pressure on programs such as Universal TK and ELOP? So in our outlook, again, as I mentioned, we don't see a reduction, ongoing reductions necessary in that option. That is something that, again, our projection is that in 24-25, even if you take the option we gave, which reduces Prop 98 funding, you have enough funding for your existing programs, you just can't provide a COLA. So in that environment, I don't think in particular that then we would say we need to make ongoing reductions to programs or make other delays. But it could be, if revenues got worse, then I think that's when you might get to that situation. But right now, what we see as potentially more of like the need to make one-time reductions. And so we're looking at grant programs. I think one thing we'll be talking to people is, if you have these issues, if we've already done all the grant programs, for example, we've already pulled back all of the one-time funding that's sort of what I would call low-hanging fruit, that's not painful, and we have to go back and make other cuts, like do school districts, if we went back and took some and made reductions to the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, which has a very long timeline, is that preferable than, say, reducing ELOP or reducing making other reductions to other ongoing programs? I think that's a conversation that we will want to have with districts. But I think that at this point, we don't see that there's necessarily pressure to make ongoing reductions to programs. In terms of, I got a question on the COLA for 25-26. That I don't have that on hand. I can find it and share it. Maybe Tatia can share with you later. I don't think I have the 25-26 ones on hand here. Our projection on the COLA for 24-25 is 1.27%. I think at some point we said it was 1.02%, and then we got new information from the federal government that moved it to 1.27%. And then I think so. I'm going to take one question about universal meals. So similarly, I think I would say related to similar to that response on ELOP or other programs. I think right now there's not necessarily a need to make ongoing reductions, but it's definitely one to look at. I know there's been some concern just about the cost pressures associated with universal meals. The spending, general fund spending on that program has increased substantially. And one thing that I know we're looking into is that I think there was a recent change in the federal regulations around the community eligibility provisions that we think could have interaction. Under the universal meals statute, we're requiring districts to participate in one of these programs, and it could be that the regulations have changed such that the participation is maybe not always a good deal fiscally for the state or for districts. So I think that's something that we're looking into to see if there's a way to say prevent costs in that program from going up more significantly. One question was about Prop 28. So Prop 28 has I think our understanding of the role is 1% of K-12 Prop 98 funding. And so the way that it typically then would work, and it's 1% of funding provided in the previous year. So what we suspect is that there will need to be a lag in that funding. So those are, Prop 28 is getting 1% of Prop 98. When Prop 98 shrinks, right, that if it goes down, that 1% is going to be worth less. But because it's happening sort of 1 year lag, essentially, that decline will happen a little more slowly than it would otherwise have occurred. Okay, and sorry, there was a question about someone who's fairly new, a fairly new CBO. I wanted to have some basics on Prop 98. So just at a very high level, Prop 98 is a constitutional formula that sets a minimum level of funding for schools and community colleges. It's driven by there's three different formulas embedded within it that set some requirements. And then every year, one of these formulas is the one that sort of holds and is the one that we use to calculate the minimum guarantee in that year. It's a minimum. The state can provide more than is required. However, typically, more commonly, the state funds at or around the minimum guarantee. So typically, you can think of the minimum guarantee as a reasonable estimate of what school and community college funding will be over time. And that funding is changing. It's sensitive to general fund revenues changes, and so there are, and we update it even after the close of the fiscal year. So there are always kind of increases and changes in the formula, which is often why, for example, the state provides a lot of one-time funding, because oftentimes we're making up for 2 years ago we owed some funding for Prop 98, and we provided through one-time funding. So that's one of the things that would it matters in that it sets kind of the table for what the basic expectations are of funding for schools and community colleges. Okay, I'm looking through some of these questions again. Okay, so there's a couple of questions that are related to potential reductions to the discretionary block grant or learning recovery block grant. So again, I don't think, so I would not put that off the table as not going to happen. I think it's possible that might be a place where, if there's a need to make one-time reductions, that there would be interest. I think, again, the way that we typically approach this is first things first. We try to make reductions to unspent or pull back funding that has gone unspent, funding that has not gotten to districts yet. And so, for example, one big program right now that's there is there's a community schools grant program that the state has provided, I believe, $4 billion over multiple years to provide grants to develop community school programs across the state. A lot of that funding still has not gone out. There's an application process, and it's taking time to get those applications out. It's a lot of money. So scooping that funding, for example, obviously, if you are a fan of community schools, that means that is not going to get implemented as much, but that would mean that that you could do that. Nobody is expecting that funding or necessarily counting on that right now. So to take those funds back is not the same, doesn't have the same negative impact as, say, taking back discretionary block grant funds that you may have already planned to use. So our starting point is typically, let's start by trying to take all of the grant funding or other things that are sort of less painful for schools and community colleges. If possible, let's avoid going in and making these mid-year reductions. But I think it's going to ultimately just depend on the seriousness of the budget problem. We did go in and make some reductions on some of these programs last year, so I think it's definitely a possibility. But I think the state will explore other options. And I think as part of all of this process, I think over the next several months in building a budget, we will, our office, but also the administration and others in the legislature will be reaching out to local school districts to get your take on, if we do have to make reductions, what are the kinds of things that are more or less difficult for you. Yeah, and sorry, one of the questions was specifically about community schools, and yes, so the community schools, there's been multiple streams of funding, one-time allocations. The most recent one was $1.1 billion in 22-23, but there was, I think, almost $3 billion in previous appropriations as well. So we know that's one where there's been where there's still funding hasn't gone out yet. We know that in the state preschool program as well, there's a few $100 million in unspent funds for that we think that could be used. Again, those are funds that school districts have not been contracting or using those state preschool funds, and we expect that they would come back to the state anyways. On the universal, so there's a question about universal meals and the adjustments. Again, I think that's not one that I assume that there's going to be reductions to. I think that's something that we've just implemented, and I think there's a lot of interest in it. I think it's more it's more on the regulation side, because we know that there are some recent federal changes that have effects on sort of what share of meals can be covered with federal funding versus state funding. And so I think this is even before there was any budget issue, we've been looking at we've been trying to better understand, trying to make sure that the state rules that we have for districts and participation in these federal programs is maximizing the amount of federal funding that we're getting. So that's, I think, something that's definitely part of the conversation. I got a question on the 24-to-1, the TK 24-to-1 ratio. Will that go down to 20-to-1? That, I think, is that will be subject to budget discussions. I'm not sure what would happen. And I think it's obviously will depend on where we see the impact of ongoing programs. If we're ongoing program reductions, or you're not seeing LCFF funding increases, then that might be part of the conversation. In terms of the COLA in the current year, the state technically does have the ability to modify the COLA in the current year or to make mid-year reductions. In 2008-9, the state, when we were in the Great Recession, the state did go in and make budget reductions mid-year. We try to avoid that to the extent possible. That to us is sort of the more painful of the options. So you want to avoid doing that to the extent possible. Instead, maybe if you're not going to get COLA, maybe it means a less COLA in subsequent years. It's definitely a possibility. I think but I think that's not where anybody wants to start. I think we're typically looking at these categorical restricted programs and seeing if there's funding or reduction they can do there. I have a question about if the legislature goes with the minimum funding level, how sensitive is Prop 98 in 24-25 if the estimated revenues drop below your estimate? Under our approach, I think if we're funding the minimum guarantee at the minimum guarantee, then I think it's the more typical 40 cents on the dollar variation. So we would say that under that approach, you might have revenues could go up and down with revenues could be sensitive to that change in general fund revenues as more typical. But I think I will say with some of these big declines, I think you could see just, as we update some of these revenues, the situation can change, that you start to have situations where the marginal changes are not quite what you had anticipated. So that's something that we're going to monitor over time. I see there's a question of, has there been a consideration of to extend some opt-out options on some funding? That's not something that we've heard discussed now. I mean, I can imagine that there might be something in the future. As you can imagine, all of this has happened fairly quickly in terms of our budget situation. So I think a lot of these conversations will be occurring over the next several months as we get into the budget development stage. In terms of unused grants, I think where I was starting with is not necessarily grants that were our starting point is those grants that have not even been allocated to LEAs yet. So I think the question was, how do we figure out how much the state what's unused at each LEA? I think our starting point is let's first look at all the funds that have not gone out to LEAs. Typically, when funds have gone out to LEAs, I think we don't have that approach. I think with some, you can have, you can at some point, the state, you can sort of look at what's set aside in the ending balance at the end of the year, but that is a lag in how much funding. But I was starting with the assumption that we would sort of take the grant programs where we haven't distributed funding yet. Once we started talking about funding the LEAs already received, typically we start talking about more like across the board kind of reductions as opposed to how much been used, and that's more just because it's practical. I got a question on deferrals in 23-24. That's definitely that would be one way to say, if you're trying to get one-time savings in 23-24 and bring spending down, a deferral is a way that you would get to that approach. again, I think our preference, in mid-year, perhaps that's one way to do it so that it's not as, if it's, for example, just a June to July deferral, which the state has done before, which really ends up being a delay of like 10 days in when LAs get their funding, perhaps that's possible. But it does mean when you do a deferral, it's sort of a one-time savings, and you're gonna have to pay for it at some point moving forward. So as long as in our out years we don't see significant growth, it does mean that you're then limiting how much you have available moving forward. So I think it's one necessary that I wouldn't start with, but I know that maybe part of the conversation is something that was used in previous recessions. I think, and then I think I have a question on the possibility of pausing universal TK implementation. That's a tricky one. I don't know that they have an answer in terms of like whether it would occur or not. I would say the increases, one thing that I would point out that's different with the expansion of TK versus other elements of Proposition 98 spending is that essentially the Proposition 98 guarantee is being we call rebent, but essentially we're growing the pie of Prop 98 to cover the cost of new kids that are being served by TK expansion. So what that actually means in practice is it means that it's contributing to the non-Prop 98 general fund deficit. So I guess to the extent that that's something that would want to be considered, I think maybe that would be a consideration. But I don't. Again, I think with some of these big policies that have been recently enacted, like universal meals, like universal TK, I think there's going to be a lot of attempt to keep these in place. I don't see these as something that would be necessarily one of the first things anybody would be looking at to reduce. And then I think the last question, it was more about the 25-26 COLA. Again, I don't have that offhand. I'm going to have to I'll have to loop back with Tatia, and she can send out to a group of what we have assumed in our outlook for the cost of living adjustment.
All right, Edgar, my goodness, thank you. I have such appreciation for the complex and detailed analysis that you have done, certainly on behalf of public education. Also, just your partnership with the Department of Finance, right? As you've proposed some ideas for consideration, and I know and trust that you will have a lot of interaction with them about the budget as we go forward. And just also for being an education professional and sharing this insight with our group. I think we're all leaving this conversation much more knowledgeable about some very complex and very unique challenges ahead of us. And I'm glad that you are a part of the education landscape. We appreciate your time today. And for those of you on the call, this has been recorded, so you've got some resources there. You can reach out to us. You've got some contact information that Veronica's posting for any additional questions, and we'll work with Edgar to get those answered for you. But again, thank you for your time, insight, knowledge, and the partnership that you have in this education community. We greatly appreciate you.
Yep. Thank you, Tatia. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening to us. We're happy to answer any questions that you all may have in the future.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.